The fourth step to the wall is cementing them into place, the stones into place. We got them stacked up now. We fitted them in, but you still have to use cement. And the cement is the faith practices of the church. The deal is not to relate them to the congregation or the pastor, but to Jesus. And it's the faith practices that help us to be deeply rooted to the foundational rock, which is Jesus. And Wolfgang, of course, mentioned that just in his sermon. It's pray, study, worship, witness, invite, give, encourage, and serve. I think I'll move right into these right now because that's kind of the heart for today, the faith practices of the church. So there's a new handout. I think it's, what color is that handout?
Yellow.
Yeah, goldenrod, thanks. Yeah, goldenrod. So maybe refer to that, please. Al Beddish is a spouse of one of our pastors, Lou Beddish, and he lived in a Chicago suburb. And Al is dying of cancer. He's under hospice care now. He doesn't have that long to live. So about 3 weeks ago, I asked if I could go to the Beddish's house and bring Holy Communion. And Al and Lou were gracious to say, please, Bishop, come. So I brought Holy Communion, and Al was really alert, and in fact, he could stand up and walk and everything. But he didn't have long to live. So before communion, we had a real good conversation. But in the beginning of the conversation, I asked Al what he had done for a living, because I didn't know him. Well, I knew him, but I didn't know him very well. He said, well, you know, I worked at Menards for 35 years. And I worked in plumbing, and I worked in cabinets, and I worked in tile. He said, I just loved helping people with their home projects, coaching them, teaching them, guiding them. And then he said, Bishop, if you don't mind, let me show you what I've done around the house here. So Al took me on a tour of what he's done. And he remodeled a couple bathrooms, he remodeled his kitchen, he put tile on the entryway, and they're really beautiful. And then it struck me that Al was so successful in coaching others because he practiced it himself. He knew how to do it himself. He was familiar personally with tile and cabinets and plumbing. I think that's for us that are called to be rostered leaders in the church. First, we practice the faith so we can pass it on to others. I don't remember the phrase that Wolfgang used, but if you don't have it, you can't give it.
Right.
Yeah.
If you ain't got it.
You can't give it. So I think the first job is for us to practice the faith, and then we can assist our people in our communities to practice the faith as well. Okay, first question I want to ask is, what is a disciple? Raise your hand. What is a disciple? Follower? Learner? My favorite one is apprentice.
There you go.
Apprentice. A disciple is an apprentice. Now, how does one become a disciple? How does one become a disciple? By sitting and listening? I don't think so. I think one becomes a disciple by observing and mimicking. You see, the first way is the Western way. I sit, and I like we're doing right now. Yeah. You know, we sit and we listen, and we may take a couple notes. But in the Eastern culture, that's not the way to do it. They ask you to observe, and then they ask you to mimic. Do the same. Now, my son Matthew is a black belt in Taekwondo, which is the Olympic karate, and he's quite accomplished in it. I took karate with Matthew as a father-son activity for some years, and then Matthew went way beyond my ability. But when Matt first started in karate, he started before I got into it too. I'd bring him to the dojo in Geneva, Illinois, Mr. Kim's Black Belt Academy. And Mr. Kim would line Matthew up in the back row. He was a white belt. In the front wall were the black belts, and then the red belts, and then the brown belts, and then the blue belts, and the yellow belts, and then Matthew in the back. And after a couple of practices, I just went to practice just to see how this was. I want to make sure it was safe and good. I brought Mr. Kim to the side, and I said, Mr. Kim, I have something to ask you about. He said, Pastor Gary, he knew I was a pastor. Go ahead. And I said, well, Matthew's in the back row. He can't learn karate because he can't hear. And Mr. Kim shook his head and said, Pastor Gary, you don't learn karate from listening. You learn karate from watching and mimicking over and over and over again. So you see the white belts and the black, you can see the yellow belts, which is the next rank, and then the next rank, and then they can see all the other belts, how these different movements progressed. And by watching and mimicking, Matthew became a black belt. That's what an apprentice is about. I've watched carpenter apprentices who helped us build our cabin in northern Minnesota. The Tinquist brothers were our carpenters, and they had an apprentice. And what they would do, David Tinquist would say, come on over here. He'd say, watch this. And he'd say, you do it. And then that's what it was about. Watching, mimicking, and practicing. I got to say something about Lutheran theology here. Discipleship is not works righteousness. The faith practices are not so that we'll get into heaven. This is what Jesus has already done. You know, the deal is set. God has saved us by God's grace through Jesus Christ. But the faith practices are a gift from God, a gracious gift from God, to assist us on our life journey. That's what they're about. If I'm a better Bible studier or prayer or giver, does that mean I'm going to get into heaven? Absolutely not. It's by God's grace that any of us make that. But these are given to assist us along the way. I kind of think one other little illustration, I don't know where it is, I think it's in Isaiah, where it says, and there's a hymn on this, have thine own way, Lord, have thine own way. Thou art the potter, I am the clay. Mold me and knead me after thy will, while I am waiting, yielded and still. I see God as a potter, we are the clay, and these faith practices are the hands of God that mold God's people and shape God's people into the image of Christ, like Thomas à Kempis. All right, let's go over these faith practices. The first one is prayer, or the first one I want to talk about is prayer. And as we know, prayer is simply communication with God. And three questions or three comments I want to make about prayer. The first one is, it seems illogical that we would communicate with God who we cannot see or cannot hear. It's a difficult concept for Western people that are pretty logically orientated. How are we supposed to communicate with God that we don't hear and we don't see? Here's how I have come to grips with that myself. In my second congregation, I had the director of Fermilab as a member, Phil Livedall. Fermilab was one of these laboratories that had a ring and would shoot these electrons and protons and neutrons around. And Phil was one of the guys that discovered quarks, as a matter of fact. They crashed them into each other and studied how the universe started and all the different things. It was and he supervised 2,000 scientists of different types. Anyway, Phil was a member of the congregation, came to church all the time. And one Sunday after church, we were having coffee together, and I said, Phil, how can an eminent scientist like you believe in God? Don't you have a problem with that? And Phil said, Gary, every day I work with things I can't see, but I know exist. Quarks, neutrons, electrons, protons. Now, when I look around me, I have much more evidence of God than there's evidence of electrons. God's creation and people. It's easy to believe in God. Just look at the evidence. And I think he also told, I know he did, he said, the most powerful things in this world you can't see. Gravity, wind, love. It's from a physicist. Pretty good. Second question that I ask myself sometimes is, how can I be so presumptuous to think that I could actually communicate with God, me being creature and God being creator, especially half the time being a lousy creature? Well, the fact of the matter is, it's not because of us that we're able to pray, but because of God's graciousness that we're able to pray. God himself invites us into this relationships. It's not something that we do or can do, but it's something that God dearly desires in terms of our relationship with God. Now, it's interesting. Communication is a two-way street. And for most of my life, especially when I was in the parish, I was a blabbermouth to God. I did a lot of the talking, I need this, please, blah, blah, blah. But now, in these last few years, I've been more into listening. God knows what I need, what I do dumb. But what I need to hear from God is, what direction should I go? What should I do? How can I be faithful? And I've discovered that God does speak to us through the scriptures, through other people, through music, and other ways in our heart and our mind. God does speak. But it's hard for us to listen, especially when we're constantly preoccupied. And that's one of the problems of our day, I think. Because to listen to God, we have to be quiet. And then one other question, then I'm going to ask you to do a little exercise. Does God answer prayer? Or is it just a psychological game? Now, here's a story. Remember that church I was invited to a long time ago, Luther Memorial Church in North Minneapolis? Well, I started going to Sunday school, and I had Mrs. Pearson. And I think this might have been 5th grade, I'm not positive. And Mrs. Pearson was teaching on prayer. And she's using the verse, ask and you shall receive, seek and you shall find, knock and the door will be opened unto you. And Mrs. Pearson said, God always answers prayer. So I believed Mrs. Pearson, and I went home and every day started praying for a pony. As you heard, I lived in this little shack at the back of the lot, right in the north side of Minneapolis. But Mrs. Pearson said, so I prayed, and I prayed for probably 3 weeks every day for a pony, and then I didn't get one. So at Sunday school, I raised my hand and I said to Mrs. Pearson, that prayer stuff just doesn't work. And she grabbed me by the hand and said, Gary, come with me. So she brought me to see Pastor Breyer. Now, Pastor Breyer's office was upstairs, and I don't know what he was doing in there during Sunday school. I don't know if he was working on a sermon or, I don't have any idea. But he wasn't down with the people when he was up in his office. Mrs. Pearson brought me in there, sat me down, and said, Gary has a question for you, Pastor. And then she left. Now, Pastor Breyer is one of these pastors that had the glasses on the end of their nose, and he was a giant guy, behind this giant desk. I was scared to death. And Gary, he said, what's your question? I said, well, Pastor, I don't know about prayer. I don't know if God answers prayer because I've been praying every day for 3 weeks for Pony, and God hasn't answered me. And, of course, the pastor laughed. And he said, God has answered your prayers, Gary. God said no. And then he went on to say, what in the world would you do with a pony at your house? People already said something like, they make a mess or something. And then he continued, and funny, I remembered this. All these years he said, sometimes God says yes, sometimes God says no. And sometimes God says not yet. Now, I've got one more to that, and that is sometimes God says, you do it. You're the answer for prayer in this situation. I'm equipping you and calling you. You do it. Say something as I've been listening to friends. I believe that there are some faith practices that are more natural to us than others because of our personalities or because of our place in life, and some are more difficult. And then I've noticed over the years that they change. A faith practice that used to be very helpful and we felt very comfortable with, we were fed with, we could teach well, is not that way anymore. And we fall into others. For example, prayer for me has become profound because my job is too hard. I mean, the bishops will attest to that, and many of you will attest to it. I've had jobs that I felt I was pretty gifted for and okay at, and I comfortable with, but every day now I face things that I can't handle. So I was not much of a prayer until God played a joke on me and called me into this job. He said, darn it, Gary, I'm going to teach you to pray one way or another. Get on your knees because this is going to be hard for the next many years. Okay, I'm going to talk about one that I used to really love and embrace, but now I'm not very good at. And that's serve. Serve our neighbor. I think when I was in the parish, I think the most satisfying stuff I ever did was in relationship to serving people that were lonely or living in poverty, and hands-on. At Gethsemane Lutheran Church in Cicero, for example, every year we'd have banquets on Christmas and Easter, the 4th of July, Thanksgiving, and we'd invite the homeless in, and the poor in, and the lonely in, and we'd bake ourselves and do it all day. We had a guy in the parish, Bill Fitzsimmons, a physician, great guy, would insist that we'd serve wine and champagne at these great banquets. And we didn't use paper plates, but we used china. And you know why we did that? Because Bill was a great theologian and said, in these guests and visitors that we're hosting, it's Jesus. So how can we give Jesus a paper plate? So, and the Congregational Council was great. This is Cicero, Illinois now, about serving wine and champagne, and they probably said, how about a little vodka too? But we didn't do that. And then, actually on these holidays, we would deliver meals, because in Cicero, they didn't have meals on wheels on these holidays, so these people would go without meals. So we'd pack up the meals, and Dr. Fitzsimmons would buy these little bottles of wine and put them with their meals. I'd say, Bill, what if they got sick? He'd say, well, what a way to die. That's a true story. And then in the next parish, I served at the shelter, the homeless shelter in Aurora, Illinois, and I was kind of like a bodyguard because the people would fight all the time, and I was there to protect the people in that, and I found a lot of fulfillment in that. But nowadays, in my job, I don't hardly do any of that anymore. And when I do, it's just kind of a symbol. And like when we were in Detroit, I was very happy, Don, to participate in the service. I thought it meant a lot, but I knew that this is just a few-hour thing. A few people see me do this, I'll sweat a little bit, but I'll never come back to Detroit and make a difference in that kind of way again. So my calling now has not served me well in the faith practice of service. But I bet it has served you, and I have heard, and you have heard over and over again, I get much more out of serving than I ever give. I want to say a word about, I think, giving.
Amen.
Thank you. That boy screen is. I was at Bethel Lutheran Church in Chicago on my internship. It's an inner city congregation on the west side of Chicago, and I just got there. I was there my second Sunday, and Dave Nelson, my supervisor, said, "Gary, I want you to learn about church life from all aspects. This morning, I want you to count the offering." So I went down to the basement, in the basement office there, and I counted the offering with Dave telling me what to do, the pastor telling me what to do. The first check or envelope was Polly and mine, and it was for $5. The second was Charlie Collins. It was for $50, 10 times. And after I counted the offerings, I said to Dave, Charlie's offering was for $50. He only gives that once a month or a couple times a year, because Charlie had 8 kids. He was a part-time mail carrier, and he lived in a very modest house a couple blocks from the church. And he happened to be president of the congregation, great guy. And Dave said, no, that's what Charlie gives every week. he said, why don't you go down and talk to Mr. Collins? So I called Mr. Collins on the phone, and I said, Mr. Collins, could I talk to you about something? He said, come on, I'll put the coffee on. So I went to Charlie's house. He was sitting on the front porch, and he had the coffee pot and a couple of cups there. And I sat down. I didn't know how to address this. What am I going to say to him? So I kind of hammered on, and Charlie said, Pastor Gary. I was calling him Pastor Gary. What did you come down here for? And I said, well, Mr. Collins, I counted the offering this morning. He said, oh, good. And I said, but Charlie, I said, you gave so much. And Charlie said, I wish it was more. And then I said, Charlie, how can you give so much? And he said, I give because God has given me so much. And then I give so I can be the person I claim to be, a Christian. Because giving is the Christian way of life. Giving is the Christian way of life. So I said, thank you. I went home to, we lived next door to the church in an apartment deal. I said to Polly, Charlie just gave me 4 years of seminary in 10 minutes. And, taught me what a Christian is about. So we started tithe and have ever since. And a lot of times we get ourselves in trouble where we start, giving 20% and all that when things come up. But we've always tithed, and it's been a great blessing to us because it's helped us to put first things first. You see, Luther, when he talks about the first commandment, says that if we get the first commandment right, everything falls into place. I am the Lord thy God, thou shalt have no other gods before me. But people in our country, we put material things before God. First fruit giving and tithing is an antidote for that. And it's a help for us to put God first. Amen. Now, I worry about this with our rostered leaders today, friends, and dear bishops, because they have so much debt. And it's so difficult with that debt weighing them down that we got to relieve them from that debt so they can begin to lead in congregational life in such a way that they can model first fruits and tithing. And for many people, but I think probably for me and Polly, but for me certainly, it was the giving aspect that led to any other kind of spiritual life. And it's been most satisfying and most helpful.